Your body is not broken. It is bricked up. Every morning you wake inside a structure that was built during moments you survived, but never fully left. The tightness across your shoulders that you call poor posture. The shallow breathing you have learned to normalize. The inexplicable contraction that moves through your chest when something ordinary triggers something ancient. You have been treating these as inconveniences, as mechanical problems, as failures of discipline or flexibility or sleep. You have been stretching the wrong thing. You have been meditating around it rather than through it. You have been breathing deeply into a container whose walls were poured years ago and have long since set. Meanwhile, the cost compounds quietly. The nervous system that was designed to move you through danger and return you to rest gets stranded in a perpetual half-state, neither fully alarmed nor fully at ease, burning energy to maintain a vigilance that no longer has an object. The body holds the posture of a threat that has already passed. And every day you carry that architecture forward, adding new experiences on top of old ones that were never discharged, never completed, never allowed to move from the body's interior into the open air and dissolve. The ancient traditions knew this. The physicians of classical China spoke of stagnant qi, the life force that pools and hardens when it cannot circulate, producing what they recognized not merely as physical pain but as the somatic residue of unprocessed experience. The Sufi masters described a densification of the subtle body, a thickening of what they called the latif, the spiritual centers, when grief and fear and shock were suppressed rather than expressed through intentional movement and breath. These were not metaphors to them. They were anatomical observations made before the vocabulary of neuroscience existed to confirm them. Peter Levine spent 4 decades confirming them anyway. His framework of somatic experiencing, developed after watching a woman named Nancy freeze and then spontaneously complete a defensive movement she had begun 30 years earlier during a traumatic event, gave modern language to something the ancients had never stopped practicing. He called them incomplete defensive responses, survival loops the nervous system initiates in a moment of threat, and, when the threat is too overwhelming or too sudden to process, does not finish. The loop stays open. The activation stays stored, and the body continues to brace around it indefinitely, waiting for a completion that never comes through thinking alone. This 7-minute routine exists to give that completion. It is not exercise. It is not stretching in any conventional sense. It is a deliberate, sequenced movement through the body's primary tension meridians, designed to reopen those unfinished arcs and allow the stored sympathetic activation to discharge through the very pathway Stephen Porges identified in his polyvagal theory as the bridge between physiological safety and emotional freedom. What you will feel at the end of 7 minutes is not exhaustion. It is not the temporary relief of having moved your body. It is something older and stranger and more sovereign than that. A returning, a loosening at a depth the foam roller and the breathing app and the supplement stack never reached. Because they were working on the surface of a structure whose roots go all the way down into the soil of your earliest experience, and this goes there with them. The fascia is the first place to understand, not as passive connective tissue wrapping your muscles in a biological cling film, but as a living sensory organ, the most body-wide sensory organ you possess, containing, as the anatomist Jaap van der Wal has documented, 10 times more sensory nerve endings than the muscles it surrounds. The fascia is not inert. It is listening. It is continuously reporting the state of the interior landscape to your central nervous system, and it is continuously being shaped by the signals that nervous system sends back. When you experience a threat, the fascial network contracts. When you survive that threat and process it fully, the fascia releases. When you do not process it fully, the fascia remains in a state of chronic low-grade contraction, pulling on the bones and organs it encases, altering your posture, restricting your breath, changing the very geometry of your movement through space. Thomas Myers mapped this in extraordinary detail in his work on anatomy trains, demonstrating that the body's fascial lines run in long, continuous tracks from the soles of the feet to the crown of the skull, and that tension in one part of a track creates compensatory patterns throughout the entire chain. This is why the chronic tightness in your jaw has a relationship with the chronic tightness in your hip flexors. They are on the same line. They are part of the same unfinished conversation. And Bessel van der Kolk, whose decades of clinical work culminated in the landmark text "The Body Keeps the Score," was even more direct. The body does not store trauma as a narrative. It stores it as a posture, as a pattern of muscular bracing, as a reorganization of the autonomic nervous system around an experience that the conscious mind has moved past, but the soma has not. The polyvagal theory that Porges developed over 30 years of research reveals the precise mechanism by which the routine works. The vagus nerve, the longest cranial nerve in the body, operates as a two-directional highway between the brain and the viscera, and it has two distinct branches that correspond to two radically different physiological states. The ventral vagal branch, associated with social engagement, safety, and presence, keeps you anchored in connection and ease. The dorsal vagal branch, associated with shutdown and collapse, takes over when threat is perceived as inescapable. Slow, deliberate movement sequences that engage the neck, jaw, shoulders, spine, and hips activate the ventral vagal circuit directly, signaling through the body's own architecture that the emergency is over, that the incomplete response can now complete, that it is safe to finish what the nervous system began and then suspended. 7 minutes. That is the threshold, not because of any arbitrary convention, but because the duration maps to the average time the body requires, when given proper sequential cues through these specific tension meridians, to cycle through one full arc of sympathetic activation and parasympathetic return. You will feel the shift. It is unmistakable. The Taoists called the practice of deliberate movement through the body's energy pathways Qigong, and they understood it as a technology for maintaining the free circulation of Jing, the essential life essence through the meridian system. The specific slow movements of medical Qigong, documented in texts that predate Western medicine by 2,000 years, trace exactly the same fascial lines that Myers would later name anatomy trains. This was not coincidence. It was systematic observation carried forward across generations. The Sufis practiced a form of movement called hadra, the presence in which repetitive rhythmic motion was used to dissolve what they understood as the crystallized grief and fear that block the heart's natural openness. The specific oscillatory movement patterns of hadra produce measurable increases in vagal tone, as documented in contemporary research, because the Sufis were using the body's own regulatory architecture without needing to name it in Latin. The yoga tradition of ancient India encoded similar knowledge in the sequence of the sun salutation, Surya Namaskar, which moves through every major spinal flexion and extension, engaging the sympathetic and parasympathetic regulatory systems in alternation, teaching the nervous system through repeated physical experience what safety and activation feel like when they exist in healthy rhythm with one another. And in the indigenous traditions of the Americas, trauma was processed not through talk, but through dance, through shaking, through the deliberate tremoring movements that David Blevins and later Peter Levine would recognize as the body's natural discharge mechanism. The same mechanism you can observe in a deer after escaping a predator, the full-body tremor that releases the survival energy before the animal returns to grazing. The ancients did not suppress this tremor. They made ceremony of it. They understood it as sacred technology. The Hermetic principle of correspondence, as named in the Kybalion of ancient Egypt, states that the patterns of the macrocosm are reflected in the microcosm, that the movement of energies in the universe follows the same laws as the movement of energies in the body, the tension, flow, release, and renewal that govern the cycles of nature, govern the cycles of human experience. Levine did not invent somatic experiencing. He rediscovered its grammar in the language of modern neuroscience. He gave the Academy a way to hear what the traditions had been saying for millennia, that the body is the soul's first translator, and that liberation begins not in the mind but in the tissue. There is a common enemy beneath all of this, and it is not the trauma itself. It is the accumulation of incomplete cycles, the body's backlog of unfinished business that keeps the system in a low-grade state of defended readiness, spending its energy on maintenance of old structure instead of presence in current life. You have tried the talk therapy. You have tried the supplements and the meditation apps and the journaling, and perhaps they have helped at the level they were designed to operate, but none of them reached into the fascial architecture and gave the body what it actually requires: a physical completion of the arc. The nervous system began and never closed. The special guide called Healing in Motion, 22 somatic cycles to release trauma, restore flow, and return to creation, was built precisely for this, 22 cycles that move through every primary tension meridian in the specific sequence your nervous system requires to complete those open loops, one by one, morning by morning, until the architecture of the defended body begins to soften into something more spacious and original. People who have worked through it describe a quality of ease they had forgotten was possible, a return to a version of themselves they thought they had simply outgrown. Those real accounts are there in the first pinned comment below, written by people whose words carry the unmistakable tone of someone who has been returned to themselves. The link to access this guide is there as well, available for a limited time because what it contains is not meant to circulate indefinitely as content. It is meant to be used. Find it pinned in the first comment and begin. The science did not arrive late to this understanding. It arrived exactly on time, carrying instruments precise enough to measure what the traditions had always known in their bones. Bruce Lipton's work in epigenetics, published in The Biology of Belief, demonstrated that the expression of your genes is not fixed, that the cellular environment, shaped by chronic stress, by held emotion, by the sustained activation of threat responses in the nervous system, can alter which genes are expressed and which remain dormant. The body you inhabit today is not merely the body your DNA prescribed. It is the body your accumulated experience has been sculpting at the molecular level, switching certain capacities off, amplifying others, reorganizing your biology around the architecture of your survival. This is not metaphor, this is measurable, and it means the reverse is equally true, that changing the body's physiological state through deliberate somatic practice changes the environment in which your cells express themselves. The ancient traditions called this transformation. Lipton calls it epigenetic regulation. The mechanism is the same. The neuroplasticity research of Michael Merzenich at the University of California, San Francisco, showed that the brain remains structurally plastic across the entire lifespan, that the neural pathways encoding chronic threat responses and defensive postures can be interrupted and replaced with new pathways encoding safety, fluency, and ease, but only when the body is engaged as the primary medium of that change, not merely the mind. Thinking differently is not enough. The nervous system learns through repetition of physical experience, through the felt sense of a movement completed, a breath allowed, a tension dissolved. This is why Van der Kolk concluded, after decades of clinical observation with thousands of trauma survivors, that approaches focused exclusively on verbal processing of traumatic memory left the body untouched, the survival patterns intact, the architecture unreformed. You cannot think your way out of a posture the body adopted in a moment before thought was possible. The fascia research of Helene Langevin at Harvard Medical School adds another layer of confirmation. Her laboratory demonstrated that slow, sustained movement in connective tissue, the kind produced by deliberate somatic practice rather than vigorous exercise, generates measurable changes in fascial hydration, in the electrical signaling between fascial cells, and in the inflammatory markers associated with chronic stress. The fascia, she found, communicates. It is not passive wrapping. It is a dynamic, responsive, communicating system that responds precisely to the quality of attention and movement you bring to it. Slow, deliberate movement is not less effective than vigorous movement. For this purpose, it is categorically more effective. Science did not explain the mystical. It finally learned to describe it accurately. The protocol itself begins before you rise from bed. In the first moments of waking, before the mind assembles its agenda, you bring your awareness to the soles of your feet and feel them against the sheet or the air. Really feel them, the temperature, the pressure, the weight of your own body understood from the bottom up. This is not a warm-up. This is the signal to the nervous system that you are beginning, that something intentional is about to happen inside a body that is safe and present, and willing to complete what remains unfinished. Then you sit upright, spine long but not rigid, and you begin the first movement of the jaw and the back of the skull. You allow your mouth to open wider than feels necessary, and you let it close slowly, and you do this 3 times with your eyes soft and your breath moving in through the nose and out through an open, slightly parted mouth. The jaw holds an extraordinary volume of accumulated tension. It is where words unspoken, cries unsounded, responses unsayable in the original moment of overwhelm were swallowed back into the body. Releasing it begins the sequence at the first of the major meridians. The routine travels. From the jaw, you move to the shoulders, rolling them slowly backward and downward in a movement that feels almost decadent in its deliberateness. 3 full rotations, and on each downward pass you allow a slow exhale to accompany the descent. You're not loosening a muscle, you are completing a surrender the body began and interrupted. Between each rotation you pause, you feel what is present, and you give it a breath. The spine comes next. Seated or standing, you allow a slow flexion forward, vertebra by vertebra, from the crown downward, your arms hanging without intention, your jaw still soft, and you breathe into the spaces that feel most resistant, not forcing expansion but inviting it, the way you would invite something frightened to approach rather than grabbing at it. You hold the bottom of that arc for a slow count of 5 before rising. Again, vertebrae by vertebrae, the lower spine reconstructing its length before the middle and the upper follow. The hip flexors, that deep psoas muscle, carry the most ancient of the survival contractions, as Van Cook and Levine both observed. In a low lunge, front knee over ankle, back knee soft on the floor, you breathe into the front of the hip without tilting the pelvis forward, simply allowing the breath to find the deep interior, where the psoas attaches to the inner spine. And you stay there for 7 slow breaths, feeling for the moment, which arrives without announcement, when something releases that is not muscular, but something deeper, something that felt like decision and is now becoming permission. The final phase is stillness. 2 full minutes of lying on your back with arms extended slightly from your sides, palms open to the ceiling, jaw soft, eyes closed, breathing without management or technique, allowing the body to integrate what the movement has begun. You are not doing anything in these 2 minutes. You are allowing the nervous system to complete its own arc, to move from activation through release into genuine rest. You will feel things arise in these minutes. Let them. A tremor in the legs is completion, not malfunction. Warmth spreading through the chest is discharge, not sentimentality. Tears that appear without a story attached to them are the body finishing sentences it began years ago. 7 minutes. The same time every morning, the body learns to trust the ritual before your mind has finished deciding whether to believe in it. Her name, in the way that matters for this telling, was Elena, though she would recognize herself in whatever name you assign her, because what happened to her has happened to a generation of people who learned very early that their nervous systems were not safe places to inhabit. She was 34 when she found the routine, and she had spent 12 of those years in various forms of structured self-improvement, not from vanity, but from a genuine and sustained desire to feel at home in herself. She had done the therapy, the good kind, the kind that takes you back through the rooms of the past and tries to reframe what was found there. She had done the breathwork and the cold water, and the retreating and the journaling, and she said, describing it afterward, that all of it had given her a better relationship with her story, without ever quite changing the physical fact of living inside her body, which remained vigilant, remained braced, remained slightly removed from the present moment, the way a person stands in a doorway rather than walking fully through. The 3rd morning of the routine, she felt the tremoring in her legs during the hip flexor hold, and she stopped because she thought something was wrong. The 4th morning, she let it continue, and she described it as the most peculiar and then the most natural feeling she had ever had in her own body. Like something that had been wound very tightly was finally being allowed to unwind at its own speed. By the 2nd week, she noticed the change not in any moment of dramatic clarity, but in a Tuesday afternoon, when she realized she had been sitting in a chair for 40 minutes without holding a breath around anything, without the low-grade monitoring of her own interior state that she had assumed was simply the texture of consciousness. She was just sitting, just present, just in the room with herself in a way that felt, she said, not like a new arrival but like a return. This is what the routine returns to people, not a transformed self, a recognized one. The first obstacle you will encounter is the voice that says, 7 minutes is too simple for a problem this large. This is a reasonable voice. It has been formed by a culture that equates difficulty with legitimacy and equates complexity with depth. A culture that built an entire industry of sophisticated intervention around experiences that were, at root, as simple and physical and animal as what a deer does after surviving a chase through a field. You have been sold elaborate maps of your interior landscape, when what you needed was permission to move through the actual territory. The voice of doubt is not wrong about the size of the wound. It is wrong about the size of the medicine required to address it. The second obstacle is the body's own protective contracting at the edge of unfamiliar sensation. When you enter the hip flexor hold and something begins to tremble, the first instinct of the conditioned nervous system is to grip, to brace, to manage the sensation back into a known and bounded shape. This is the same instinct that prevented the original discharge, and this is the precise moment the routine asks you to stay. Softly, without forcing, without expanding into the sensation, aggressively, but also without retreating from it. You are not breaking anything open. You are making yourself available to what has been trying to close. Start with one cycle, not 7 minutes. One movement. The jaw opening 3 times with conscious breath. Do only that for 3 days if that is what feels containable. The nervous system responds to consistency more than it responds to duration, and a 30-second practice repeated daily for a week will do more than a comprehensive 40-minute session done once with enormous willpower and then abandoned. You are not trying to resolve the backlog all at once. You are reopening the channel through which resolution moves, and the body, given any reliable opening, knows exactly what to do with it. It has always known. It was waiting for the invitation. The deeper truth is one that every genuine healing tradition has encoded in its most sacred practices, and it is this: you will not damage into becoming who you are. You are organized. The body, in the presence of overwhelming experience, made a series of extraordinarily intelligent adaptations to ensure your survival, and it maintained those adaptations faithfully, at great metabolic cost, because no one ever came back and told it that the emergency was over. The work of releasing stored trauma is not the work of fixing what is broken. It is the work of delivering the message that was never received, of returning to the nervous system the information it has been waiting for, that you survived, that the completion is allowed now, that the arc can close. Rumi wrote, in a passage from the Masnavi that still carries the heat of lived experience after 8 centuries, that the wound is the place where the light enters you. He did not mean that suffering is romantic or redemptive in its rawness. He meant what the Veen would confirm in clinical language 600 years later, that the place of greatest contraction is simultaneously the place of greatest potential opening, that the armor and the doorway are the same structure, and that what determines the difference is only whether you approach it with force or with the quality of patient, embodied, deliberate presence that both the mystic and the scientist recognize as the essential ingredient. This is biological restoration, not healing in the sense of recovering from illness, restoration in the sense of returning a structure to its original form, clearing the accumulated material that was added in emergency and was never meant to be permanent, allowing the system that was designed to move fluidly through activation and rest to resume its natural rhythm. You were not born defended. You learned defense as a survival strategy in a specific context, and the intelligence that learned it can unlearn it. Given a body that is moved through its own tension, meridians with sequence and intention, and enough mornings of quiet willingness to let the story that lives in the tissue finally reach its ending, if what you have heard here has moved something in you, has shifted even slightly the way you understand the contract between your past and your present body, then type the words "I am returning" in the comments below, not as performance but as declaration, as the kind of statement that, when you read it back in your own hand, reminds you that something in you already knows the way home. This channel exists for one purpose: to bring you the science and the tradition and the practice that returns you to yourself week after week. Because there is no more important territory than the interior of your own experience, and you deserve guides who take it seriously. Subscribe now and turn on the notification bell so that nothing released here reaches the world without reaching you first. Share this with one person who you know is carrying something heavy in a body they have been apologizing for. They do not need the apology. They need the doorway, and click any video now appearing on your screen, and let the next piece of the map find you. You have already taken the first step. The body remembers how to do the rest.